Let's all settle into place. Let's all have a seat. Welcome back to the 9th Annual Double Exposure Film Festival. My name is Lana Garland. I'm the Director of Programming. Next up, we have a panel entitled Investigative Filmmaking Under Fire, The Holly, a Case Study. The reason or how this particular panel was conceived was from my very close proximity to the filmmaking on The Holly. I'm one of the executive producers of the film, and let me tell you, I guess you said, you called me first in 2016 or 2014? 2014, when I was at the Southern Documentary Fund, and Julian Rubinstein was looking for a fiscal sponsor. I did not know that these many years later, I would be a part of the team and in deep relationship with Julian. Can we tell the folks in the hall that we're beginning? Thank you. And so let me set the scene. So I get the call. This guy tells me he's a journalist, an investigative journalist, and he wants to do a documentary. Pain point one. Then he goes on to say he is working on this story. He's originally from Denver, and he wants to tell this story that's very Denver-based, but it's situated in the African-American community. Pain point number two. And so over the years, this person would just call me, and first he asked me to come on as a consultant, and there were moments when we would have these long 2-3 hour conversations on the phone, and I knew it was like on full tilt when I would see my husband coming around the corner like this, looking to see what's going on in the office, because I am yelling, and I'm like, okay, so I yelled so much, I know I'll never see him again. He's gonna go away eventually. But no, it was like I had gum on the bottom of my shoe, and I could not get away from him. And that's when I understood what an investigative journalist is. I'm serious about that. People who have the cojones to just stick with it and just keep going and keep going. And I just knew that this film was going to suck so bad. But over the years, he would say, okay, all right, you said do this, I did this, and then I talked to this person, and he just assembled this whole infrastructure. But let me tell you about that. Over the years, what also happened was that there were times when my husband once again would say, are you going to be okay? And he would ask me that because Julian just called me and told me some very, very serious things that, I wasn't going through it, but you know what? It kept me up all night. I could not understand how he could withstand so many of the threats to his life. I couldn't understand what made him continue in this process of making this documentary film. And so that's where the ideation around this particular panel came from. Knowing that as you're doing the work that you do, you're going to go through this process. So let's get ahead of the conversation and think about the legalities. I don't know how Rob Gutierrez, his counsel, did what he did, but it worked. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So without any further ado, in the capable hands of Katie Townsend. Katie Townsend is the Reporters Committee's Deputy Executive Director and Legal Director. She oversees the Reporters Committee's legal services portfolio, including its litigation, vetting, pre-publication review, and amicus practices, and supervises the legal work of the Reporters Committee's team of staff, attorneys, and legal fellows / rock stars. Welcome, Katie. You take that one.
Can everyone hear me? Is that working? Okay. Thank you so much, Lana. That's the perfect introduction for the film The Holly, and the reason I think why it makes such an excellent case study to talk about documentary filmmakers under fire. So let me, without further ado, welcome the filmmaker behind The Holly, Julian Rubinstein. He's an award-winning journalist, also author of the book The Holly, 5 Bullets, 1 Gun, and the Struggle to Save an American Neighborhood. And Rob Gutierrez, who is a media attorney all the way from California, Los Angeles, California, with us today, from the law firm of Ballard Spahr. Let's jump right in. For those of you who have not seen the film, you should. It's fantastic. But we want to set the stage a little bit, so we're going to show the trailer from the film.
I became a blood because I really, really loved my community. I didn't become a blood because I liked wearing red.
Them days when he was a younger cat, he was protecting the hood, riding up and down the blocks, making sure that there wasn't no crib.
There was a vacuum of leadership in the Black community, and Terrence grew up in that vacuum.
Nobody expected Terrence to come back the way he did after serving 10 years in prison. And then to come out and launch one of the most successful, not only gang prevention, but violence reduction programs.
That's what it's all about right there.
All Terrence had was a vision to stop the violence in the community.
It stood for peace, for community, and it was very profound.
What is the address of your emergency?
33rd and Holly. Former gang member turned anti-violence activist Terrence Roberts is accused of opening fire at a peace rally he organized last night.
Telling police that he felt threatened and fired in self-defense.
Terrence was trying to save the neighborhood he came from, and the city wanted to gentrify it.
I think he was making a lot of noise, and I think he was stepping on some people's toes that he shouldn't have. Some of these people have a lot of power.
Reverend Kelly has the key to the city when it comes to politicians and people that are in authority.
There is one Reverend Kelly. I feel like that godfather.
It's not good for somebody to get on my bad side, man.
Absolutely, I think he's been targeted.
I need y'all to take me to trial and fight for my life.
Somebody put a system together to destroy him.
Who's the confidential informant? Who's working for the police and who aren't?
You're going to expose a lot of powerful people. That's why your life begins in danger.
I am not going to be afraid of nobody.
People have been told to not cooperate.
We look down at the end of the alley, we see 2 cars coming down real slow. As soon as they got on the other side of the dumpsters, they was firing. Pop, 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 pop. Can you see the tree right here leaking? As if it's bleeding or something.
Bullets are still flying in the Holly Shopping Center. Why?
If I was white, I'd be Captain America. But since I'm Terrence from Northeast Denver, I'm an angry activist.
If Terrence was born 25 years earlier, he would have been a Black Panther.
You looking at life in prison,
my words are getting me prosecuted, not my criminal actions.
It was either he died or the young man died. It didn't matter to those who orchestrated it who died. The goal was to make sure you stop Terrence Roberts from doing what Terrence Roberts is doing.
I love the Holly. I will fight for the Holly.
Julian, I'd love to turn it over to you right at the outset to talk a little bit about, before we get to some of the challenges and I like to say challenges, not necessarily legal risks and other types of risks, but what brought you to this story?
Well, thanks. And I don't know if I need a rebuttal to anything that Lana said. No, I'm just kidding. But I was briefly in North Carolina, and where she was, and I had not made a documentary before. And anyway, yes, I was glad to that she was there and took my calls through that time, and stayed with it. But I mean, basically, just to say that it started with because I'd been a print reporter my whole career, and I was had grown up in Denver, but I'd heard there was a small story in the New York Times even about this shooting. I mean, a feature story, and it just sounded very interesting, complex. I went out there. I ended up, talking to Terrence, being extremely interested based on what he was saying about what he said had happened, which was very different, by the way, than everything was in the media. And as I started to get a little deeper and start to talk to more people, and I basically I had actually talked to my editor at the New Yorker. I'd done a story, big story there. They were interested in other stories for me, and I realized, talking to my editor, I can't even do a magazine story on this. It's so complex. And I did a book proposal. I did get a book contract. I started reporting it. And as I was reporting on the book, I started to realize that while I thought I was sort of doing a story about a crime that had happened and sort of what the implications of it were and maybe the history of this neighborhood, I was kind of standing in the middle of a crime in progress. And I had worked with some friends on different documentaries. I'd loved documentary, and I realized that I should start doing this film. And luckily, the people that were most proximate to me and the story were okay with that. And so I did start filming. And in terms of like the danger, we had talked about a little bit when we all talked, and it was mentioned. But I knew that there was sort of potential danger in this story because of different elements that were around it. But I really didn't realize the level of danger until I got deeper into it, because I didn't realize how connected really the street violence was to really the halls of power in Denver, and not just politicians and powerful, wealthy people, but also even the heads of foundations who weren't necessarily like involved or something themselves, but they were interconnected. They were the guys who had ultimately, I realized, attacked Terrence Roberts on the day in question, were then put in to his office and took over his so-called anti-violence program. These were violent gang members who were working in a federally funded so-called anti-gang effort. And it just was like a real clear example of how a sort of a powerful structure can get out of hand, and this sort of not just a criminal justice industrial complex, but a sort of a real complex of powers in a city can end up really having a real relationship with criminal elements and carry out efforts that they wanted to get done through these people. So.
And before we dig a little bit more deeply into that, I was wondering if you could talk, especially for those of us who've seen the film, but I think certainly have gathered this from the trailer, if you could talk a bit more about your relationship with Terrence and what the dynamic was there in terms of his role with the film, how you navigated that relationship.
And that was really challenging, and I think it was actually one of the things I was talking to Lana about early on, and in fact, one of my frustrations. It was really interesting hearing the conversation in the previous panel, because I dealt a lot with pushback from the documentary community that wanted, of course, it was incredibly difficult not only trying to do sort of an investigative documentary as a white man about a black community, even though I had the buy-in from many of the key players in the community who were black, and they were all cooperating, but I was getting asked, including by Terrence at times, because people were telling him, well, wait, aren't you a producer on it? And I, of course, this was an investigative effort, and I did not want to make him a producer because of that. It wasn't that I felt that was ridiculous in any documentary. I just felt that in a journalistic, investigative documentary, that would really be problematic. And because I didn't know who I trusted, honestly, at first. And I thought it could be one of those stories where Terrence comes out to be the bad guy. He's a super complex character anyway, by the way, even through the film. But that was making it difficult not only for me at first with grants. I later was able to get several grants that helped a lot, of course, but and with Terrence, he was very aware of that, so we had a kind of a tense relationship. There's a scene in the film where I put it in there purposely to sort of show how it can get difficult. I didn't want to be in the film at all, but ultimately one of the reasons I was in it was I was so proximate to what was happening that I would have lost a lot. And among the things were his occasional outbursts at me for talking to others who clearly were not in agreement with him, which was, of course, something I had to do. And in the end, I kept saying to him, well, because he was saying I have nothing to hide. And I said, well, if you have nothing to hide, then you're going to be better off with the fact that you're not a producer on this film. Because if you are, everyone's going to say, well, what about the other side or something, So that was one of the ways I handled like my side of it, and I'm glad I handled it that way, because I think it would have ultimately been more difficult. But it was, you know, he's also someone who has really suffered a lot of PTSD. He was virtually a child soldier. His backstory is mind-bogglingly, you know, hard and hard to imagine in a lot of ways. The book, you know, is actually a much more multi-generational story, and the film does have his backstory, but he also anyway was someone who just, you know, could really be set off by things, which kind of helped him in his activism, but also hurt him in other ways, and sometimes I bore the brunt of it.
Let's jump in and talk about some of the sort of legal challenges that the film and that you faced and that the film encountered. And Rob, I want to get you in on this. So maybe you could speak a little bit to how you started working with Julian, what the context of that was.
Absolutely. I have the privilege of defending libel suits, and I do see it as a privilege because the First Amendment is a very, very powerful tool that we cannot take for granted. And I remember getting a call from a colleague in our Denver office telling me that there was a lawsuit filed against a documentary film producer in connection with a very impactful, emotional, important topic in the Denver community. And I got to know more about the project. There's this book that Julian spent a long time researching, writing, and then a documentary that was released maybe a year after the book was released. And the documentary, as you all know, there are so many legal risks that you want to be aware of. In this context, you have the issue of, do you want releases from people? Do you want personal appearance releases? Do you want life story rights? There's a perception in Hollywood, and a lot of insurance companies want everyone to think that you have to buy someone's life story. Well, you don't. You don't own your life story. You don't own the facts. It's the expression that allows someone to sell. Either you have a copyright interest in that, or you want cooperation from the person involved. More importantly, you want them to release you from any claims, which became a big issue in this case. But going back to the evolution of this, there were two individuals who were, one of them was mentioned and he appears in a small portion of the documentary. Another one does not appear in the documentary. And they filed a lawsuit against the book, claiming that they were defamed by various supposed statements about them, that they in fact were existing gang members, that they were portrayed as having committed various crimes, that they were actual informants for the police, and that they had actually ordered another individual to target Julian at a rally, to physically assault him and some say actually try to kill him. And after the documentary was released, there was first the initial complaint against the book, and then after the documentary was featured in film festivals, actually prior to the release, they amended the complaint to add the same allegations against the documentary. And I remember looking at the documentary and scratching my head. I hadn't read the book, but scratching my head because I didn't see any reference in the documentary to any of the alleged statements about these two individuals. And so I called Julian and said, am I missing something here? And he said, no, they're just not there, nor were they in the book for the most part. And we actually ended up strategizing about the best way to have the case dismissed, or try to have it dismissed. And importantly, there is a statute called the anti-SLAPP statute in about 34 states now. It's a very powerful weapon for people who are sued for exercising their free speech rights in connection with a public issue. California has a very strong anti-SLAPP statute. A few years ago, Colorado enacted a statute in large part modeled after California's statute. And with the benefit of that statute, what you do is you have an early opportunity to put your evidence before the court. If you can establish that you're sued in connection with exercising your right of free speech, and what you said is in connection with a public issue. In this case, it was an easy case to prove because obviously a documentary is in connection with free speech, it's a public forum, it satisfies that part of the statute. Was it a public issue of public interest? Well, clearly it was, given the importance of the subject in the local community and even outside the local community. So the question was, how do we convince the plaintiffs that they really need to rethink the case? And in Colorado, you have a requirement that before you file a motion to dismiss early in the case. And you're required to have what they call a meet and confer with the other side's lawyers. And you had a separate lawyer defending you in connection with a book, Steve Zansberg, who is instrumental in Colorado's passage of that state's anti-SLAPP statute. And I was defending him in connection with a documentary. So the two of us get on a phone call to have this meet and confer with the two plaintiffs' lawyers. And I asked him, there were two of them, and I said, is there any chance you didn't see the documentary? And silence. Excuse me, did you see the documentary? It hasn't been released, by the way, so silence. And so they finally had to admit, when they were called on the carpet, that they'd never seen the documentary. Nevertheless, were making accusations, very, very serious allegations, that this this young man here was defaming them by making these false statements about them. In fact, they were true statements, and let me put it this way. After that phone call, we wrote a letter telling them that under the statute, importantly, if you're a defendant and you prevail on this motion to dismiss, once you file the motion, the other side has to demonstrate a probability or a likelihood of prevailing on the claim. So you put your evidence in, declarations, whatever you have to support the fact that there is no claim here, and then the other side has to demonstrate that they actually do have evidence, and they probably can prevail. If they can present that evidence, then you lose your motion, the case goes forward. Here, they couldn't demonstrate a probability of prevailing, and they knew that. And importantly, if you can't demonstrate that you're probably going to win on the case, then the defendant has an entitlement to their attorney's fees. And that's a very important thing for all of you to know. Anyone to know who's sued for defamation in connection with free speech, in connection with a public issue. I don't want to go too long about the origin of the statute, but the point is, the point of what they're called SLAPP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation, is to try to chill free speech. And in this case, it was clear that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to silence him from putting a spotlight on something very, very important. Anyway, we sent the letter reminding them that they confirmed they'd never seen the documentary. We're going to file this anti-SLAPP motion, and once we prevailed, as we knew we would seek our attorney's fees. And there's also another statute, it's called Rule 11. Most states have some variant of it that requires the attorney to do a due diligence, basically, before filing a lawsuit to demonstrate that there's enough facts behind it to make a good faith attempt to make a claim. So that was another weapon we had. So we threatened them with both the anti-SLAPP motion and a Rule 11's motion. And within 15 minutes of receipt of our letter, they wrote back and said, we're going to dismiss the case. Does it always happen that way? No. It's a rarity. We got lucky. But every now and then, you have plaintiff's counsel who get it. They realize, well, you really should do the right thing. And here, the right thing was, well, they never should have filed the lawsuit to begin with, but when you realize that the odds are against your client, and suddenly your client may be exposed to tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees, you do the right thing, as they did in this case, and dismiss the case.
Thanks, Rob. That's a great example of the power of anti-SLAPP laws, and a plug for the Reporters Committee if you're curious whether your jurisdiction, whether your state has this kind of anti-SLAPP protection. We have a lot of free guides, easy to use resources on our website that can tell you the answer to that. Here in DC, we have a very strong anti-SLAPP law, for example. So it's good to know whether you have those kinds of protections in the state you're in, because they can make a huge difference. This is what we call in the litigation business a happy ending to a litigation story, but it was still incredibly disruptive. Julian, you were threatened with litigation on the eve of the premiere of the film at the Telluride Film Festival. Can you talk a little bit about how, even though great lawyering got you, at the end of the day, the right outcome, how even just the threats of litigation were disruptive to you and potentially disruptive to the film?
Yeah, so, I mean, and this was last year, basically, and going back just to say that I had made sure to get E&O insurance, which I also recommend to all filmmakers, independent filmmakers, because often, I guess, you don't necessarily bother to get it until you're, going to have a broadcast or something. But I knew, because, among the powerful and wealthy interests that were connected to all of this really corrupt and problematic stuff that was going on included, for example, billionaire Philip Anschutz, who was the funder of the main development in this black community that was being opposed, and knew all of these people, and all kinds of other people. I knew that there would be the real potential for a lawsuit, because there could be people who would put up the money for it. So I figured that from the beginning. I wasn't worried, because what was great about doing the book, which came out in 2021, and of course going through the legal review with my publisher FSG, I think I spent 2 months with their lawyer on the phone with all the stuff that was in this thing, and I was happy to get most of what I wanted in. And I knew that the film, of course, had sort of, less than the book. I mean, the book was sort of like 10 documentaries worth of stuff. And the stuff that was in the film was mostly like, it's on camera. It's harder to argue when someone is saying something, and we can get into the releases and so forth later. But so yes, we were about to premiere this film at a festival. It was, being, I don't know, it was public enough. I guess I was probably, putting it out on social media. It was probably getting some attention in the city. I don't remember, but. I got a letter from the lawyers. I think it was a separate letter that they said they demanded that I pull the film out of the festival and not show it, and that it was part of a lawsuit, and they demanded it not be shown. And one of the producers said, "Well, we have to tell the festival," and I was really hoping we didn't have to tell the festival, but we told the festival, and sure enough, there was a kind of a week where we didn't know what was going to happen, because they were concerned. They had a lot of questions. I had to talk to their legal counsel. Ultimately, I had to put them on my insurance, add them as an additional insured, and which happened then, which then every other festival added. And so I'm like, how much is our insurance worth now? Because there's like a lot of people on it. But anyway, yes, they did go forward, and I really wasn't worried all along. I mean, and Rob mentioned some of the more ridiculous stuff. There was a few things that you could say, like, well, I guess they could almost try to make an argument on a couple of things. They had maybe like 10 claims, like, especially in the documentary, like 8 of them weren't even in the documentary. Like, a few more of them were in the book, maybe a few. And one of the reasons, we were talking about it earlier, is that these guys were also listening to Terrence, and Terrence said a lot of stuff, and I couldn't, of course, prove or support everything this Terrence Roberts, the main subject, was saying, but I didn't put all of what he said in the film or whatever. But these guys didn't read the book, didn't see the movie, and just thought everything Terrence was saying was what I was saying. Well, that wasn't the case. So what I put in there, I could back up, and and a lot of the things weren't in there, and the things that were in there, we had plenty of evidence to show who these guys really were, and it went forward. But it also, even though it was one of the more successful and quicker things, came at a really bad time. Of course, we were trying to sell the film. We did fortunately get a deal, but we got a Gravitas Ventures picked up the film for distribution in North America, and we're on Stars and Hulu and Apple Plus and Prime. But of course, there were some other places considering it that we just don't know really how. I mean, literally, we were shopping the film to sell it while there was not only a lawsuit going on, but it was in the media. It was in the media in Denver anyway. So if you Googled it, you knew we were getting sued. And I'm sure that wasn't exactly a selling point for us. So it did not help, even though we won.
One thing I want to mention is the importance of releases. You should try to get them early on in the process. Julian can tell you this, some of the intricacies involved. But one thing that was important in this case, although we didn't need it because we had other defenses, this was a nice bow to put on the package here. One of the two plaintiffs signed a release. Let me just read the very last sentence. The last two. I understand that the producers are relying on this permission, and therefore I am making it permanent. Furthermore, I give up any and all claims against producers in connection with their use of the recordings and films. Important release. I asked his lawyers, did you know that one of your plaintiffs signed a release? Said, what do you mean? He signed a release for anything done in connection with his appearance in the movie. Can you send me a copy? So another case where they hadn't done their homework, but I think it might be helpful to talk about the process of trying to get the releases.
Well, I think it's a really nuanced thing, actually, for investigative film, journalism in general or documentary, because obviously putting a release in front of someone does raise the question of, are they going to sign it? And for example, you heard and saw in there's an important character in the film, Reverend Leon Kelly, who's a problematic figure, and frankly problematic especially because he spoke to me so much, and the problematic things in the film come right out of his mouth. And he did willingly speak to me, and only later did I realize, actually, I thought there was a day that we did these interviews and we just got everyone to sign this thing when they came in or something. He didn't sign it, probably purposefully. Maybe he didn't get it, I don't know, but we didn't get the release, and I was really freaked out later when I realized this, thinking, because you even heard one of the lines is in the trailer that he said, it's not good for people to get on my bad side, man, that he says. And that's on a phone call. So I did know it was a one-party consent state in Colorado, so he did not know I was recording those calls. And I did have several consults with a lawyer at the time because I was very concerned even about the footage and especially the phone calls. Could I use them without a release? One of the things that came up was, should I ask him now for a release? And I really said to this lawyer, I'm like, I really don't think there's any way he's going to sign it, so is it possible that it would actually make it worse if I ask him now? And he says no. And she said, actually, it might make it worse. So I said, I'm not asking him. I am not asking him now. And you really, just like, those of you who are all investigative journalists know, it's like you're strategizing at every step, every day. It's a new strategy of what is the sort of like barometer of this or that or whatever. And I feel like releases, it's really interesting because Rob and I were talking about this last night, and of course, for sure, and especially from a legal standpoint, get the release. But from a reporting standpoint, I mean, it's actually kind of it's a tricky situation with, and most of us, know, the rules, public figures, et cetera. This was a guy who was very much a public figure in Denver, involved in all these gang cases. He was like the DA's gang expert. He frankly was totally working for law enforcement. He kind of tried to hide that, but I knew that he was, and I think he was in many ways. But I really, he knew I was doing a book and a film. He knew I was a journalist. He willingly spoke to me. He actually wore a lavalier mic for us many times, which was great. And he loved being on camera. He'd never had anyone over the 30, 40 years he'd been doing all this stuff challenge him in the ways that we ended up doing. And he didn't expect it, I guess. He thought I wouldn't realize all these other things or whatever it was. But with him, and some of these others, like only one of the plaintiffs did I have a release from. Now, by the way, they both were in the movie, although one of them is barely in it. Like, he passes through a scene or two. He doesn't have any lines. The other one is in a few scenes and actually says some things, but he's the one I have the release from. So I just think with releases, I would just say, absolutely try to get them, but you really do have to think about all of the different things that, like, if you know the law as well as you can and do consult with a lawyer, there's some cases where you might not want to ask for release and get a no, because it might make your case possibly weaker. You would know more about that than me.
It's also the case that asking after the fact, they know what they've said already. They're more attuned to possible claims they might want to make. They may interpret your asking after the fact as your concern, or you have some type of agenda that you're trying to protect yourself against. So cosmetically, it is important to have those discussions sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
I'm glad we covered the issue of releases, and I should mention that we're going to try to leave a little bit of time for questions, so if folks have questions at the end, keep them in mind. I wanted to note something that Julian mentioned, another, I guess, plug for the Reporters Committee. He mentioned Colorado as a one-party consent state, meaning that you only need one party to a conversation's consent to record them, so you can do what we often call surreptitious recording without someone else knowing you're recording their conversation. That is not the law in every state. There are other states, Florida, for example, that are two-party consent states. We have a guide for that at the Reporters Committee. So if you're wondering, take a look. And one note of caution on that I would, in this day and age that we live in, with everyone has a cell phone with a different area code that doesn't reflect where they actually are, you want to kind of be cognizant of that because it can be tricky. We see these issues come up. It can be tricky. Moving to a legal issue that's more about access and less about sort of defamation liability. Watching the film, I was very struck by the power of the courtroom scenes. You were able to get a camera in the courtroom for portions of Terrence's trial, maybe all of Terrence's trial, though we only see portions of it in the film. Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, and that was the aforementioned Steve Zansberg, great lawyer in Denver. He actually handles a lot. He represents, I think, as a consortium like the Denver media. What happened in Colorado, I didn't know this till I did it, but I tried to, knowing the trial might happen, of course, at the beginning, it was kind of like, well, who knows if this will even go to trial. Of course, most cases don't. And he was facing life in prison, a guy who, the reality was, got attacked and shot someone. But I made sure to file the motion. I did contact, I was referred to Steve, and then he helped me file the motion for recording or whatever, I can't, whatever it was called exactly. And then you wait for the judge's ruling. In this case, the ruling, because of the potential danger for witnesses and others, was that we could film, but not the witness stand. And so at first I was like, oh man, this is gonna be hard. And even, one of my editors was like, yeah, we're not gonna be able to make much out of this courtroom scene. But it kept getting bigger and bigger, because what we did, which is great, is we were able to, shoot a lot of stuff in the courtroom. We had all the audio. And then, interestingly, I think we talked about it the other day, so you see Terrence on the witness stand. How did that happen? Well, the day Terrence was about to testify, he was like, I want to be on camera. I'm like, well, I don't know. We can't really, put you on camera because of the ruling. He's like, well, it's my trial. I'm like, well, go tell the judge. So he ran and found the judge at like lunchtime or whatever it was, and was like, it's my trial. And the judge said, well, I guess, yeah, I can't say you're not allowed to be filmed. He thought he was trying to help the witnesses or whatever. But if he wants to be on camera, he said, well, okay, they can film you. And that was great to have our main subject be on camera in the courtroom. The other just, downside or hard thing about it, I did want to file first. In Colorado, I guess the rule is if the judge rules you can, film something or record something in a trial, which I guess they usually do in Colorado and many other states, it's whoever files first is responsible for doing the whole pool. So here I was, never done a film before, and now the whole Denver media was covering this case every day. So I had to, not only every day, but it was like 3 times a day I had to give them the footage. So I was trying to run this whole operation. I tried to ask them, I think I asked them for like $300 each to help, because I had to, nope, they wouldn't help with anything. So I had to figure out how to, do that, which we did. But I was glad to be the one in charge of it. And then the other thing, this Reverend Kelly, who I just, not cheated toward helping me, but I did whatever I could. The extent of the rule, for example, Reverend Kelly testified, he probably would have wanted to be on camera, actually. But there's one scene which I was made very clear to get in. He walked through the camera to get up there. He has this very distinctive voice anyway, so his testimony was very clearly him. But I just left that shot. He walks through the camera to get up to the witness stand. So there was ways that we were able to use it and actually get quite a lot out of the courtroom trial, even though we had restrictions.
Having your defendant, the defendant in that case, want to be on camera was vitally important, because you may all already know, but there are so many concerns about having cameras in the courtroom. A lot of it goes back to the 1930s, the trial of Charles Lindbergh, of the man who was convicted of kidnapping and murdering his baby. There were hundreds of media reporters, big cameras, lights brighter than these lights in the courtroom, and it was a media circus. And there were a lot of concerns that flowed from that. Can the defendant in that context have a fair trial? Are the lawyers, are the witnesses playing to the cameras? Are the jurors intimidated? Are they distracted? And this U.S. Supreme Court has a couple of times, well, probably more than a couple of times, overturned convictions on the grounds that the defendant was, in their opinion, denied a fair trial due to the publicity. And obviously we have the O.J. Simpson trial years later, fully televised, and we had other trials like Peterson wasn't televised. The Murdaugh trial was. So what's the issue there? By and large, the states have the ability to determine whether or not, in a particular case, that they want to allow cameras in the courtroom. The big concern is whether or not they think that the defendant can get a fair trial, and having the defendant in this case actually want to be on camera, there was no concern there, because it was all for it.
And let me add, the more you might remember too, there's two pretty interesting scenes of Terrence with his lawyers prepping for the trial, and people have many times asked me how in the world, because it violates his privilege. Of course, what happened was Terrence, not only at the trial, but was literally demanding, he was saying, people need to see what's happening to me. His lawyer was the head of the public defender's office in Denver. He was not at all happy. He was trying to figure out what in the hell to do with this client who was really difficult and demanding. He let me film this first meeting they had, and he was trying to figure out how to deal with this, because of course it technically would violate the privilege. What if I'm now called as a witness to something? But we had another great scene where he let me again into the room because Terrence demanded it for the trial prep. And the way we did it, and this is, maybe this is done before, it was a great trick, I thought. It worked for me and for him. He said, here's the only way I can do this. I'm gonna hire you for $1 to be the videographer for Terrence, so that he can use your footage to help him prep for his trial. And if Terrence decides that I can use that footage, then it's on Terrence, but not him, because of course he was like, how do I ethically deal with this a documentary coming into the trial prep? You can't do it. So that's what we did. I signed a contract to be the videographer for Terrence's trial prep, and of course Terrence wanted me to use it in the documentary, and I did. So there's not only the trial, but we have meetings with his lawyer in the film.
We don't have much time left, and I want to be very cognizant of addressing not just the legal issues, not just the legal risks and challenges that you, Julian, faced and continue to face in connection with the film, but also some of the other challenges. And I think a great way to lead into that is to show another clip from the film. So
okay, sure.
If we could run that, that'd be great. Oh, no sound? It's not running? Okay.
We'll have it up in a second.
Okay. Well, maybe you could lead into it a bit. You've already alluded to how you came to learn throughout the course of the book and the film of the interrelationships between individuals in the community, law enforcement, other powerful actors within Denver. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really what the clip sets up.
What was really fascinating to me from the beginning and got me so interested was whether or not it was true. There were allegations in the community, and by the way, this was a story that was heavily covered in Denver, even in the New York Times. The New York Times story wasn't really factually problematic. It was a little more sort of open-ended. But in Denver, it didn't get at what was actually going on. In Denver, it was like totally just wrong. It was like, you could tell looking back, and in the film and the book, I kind of do examine it. It's sort of a sub-story, the media coverage and how they really, the fix was in basically on this event, and it was very clear that this event being the shooting, or this, ultimately it was the shooting, but it was, these Bloods were going to attack Terrence. Basically, they were trying to remove him from his position. No one in the powerful, structure of Denver, including also these gang members who he used to be, a gang member with these guys. It was not Bloods, Crips. They were all Bloods, and Terrence had left the gang and was trying to eradicate them. And these guys wanted him out. Everyone wanted Terrence out for different reasons, but they shared that goal. And it was ultimately sort of like the kind of thing that, is it going? Okay, well, let's go ahead.
Systematically eliminated black people who have tried to awaken the masses of other black people.
Does Terrence fit the profile of someone who is targeted or taken down?
He doesn't fit the profile, he personifies the profile.
Absolutely, I think he's been targeted. I mean, I've seen people in the activist community get targeted for less.
I couldn't figure out whether Carl's shop was a front or not, but it shut down soon after the shooting. I did discover that in the 6 months before the shooting, when the shop was briefly open, an undercover law enforcement effort, Operation Lita,
I think we lost the audio, so maybe you can pick it up from there.
Well, basically, so it's going into some of the, there was a lot of this innuendo, and I tried to, it was actually very, of course, I think I mentioned before, I didn't want to be in the film at all. I ended up realizing, first of all, it's a very complex story, and I also tried to just sort of separate, what I could prove, what was being said, and I found ultimately, it was one of those kind of preponderance of evidence kind of situations where I couldn't, for example, 100% prove the police were actually in cahoots with these gang members, some of whom did work for them, in ordering this attack of Terrence. But I could show that the relationships between all of these people, and that there were actually undercover operations going on right then in that community with some of these gang informants. And ultimately, what I also experienced, and there's some of it is in this clip, but just that, it was very interesting to see how people started to react to me once they realized that I kind of knew lots of people in the neighborhood and was talking to lots of people in the neighborhood and understood certain things. Because, for example, some of the police were first happy to talk to me, and then later were absolutely not interested in talking to me, and in fact try to throw our camera down at a meeting and try to stop us from covering stuff that was public. And we put it all in, So you could just see how the kind of powers that be felt entitled to shut us out with kind of muscle if they wanted to, and they did. And so that was also why I recognized that it was starting to get more dangerous, because these guys who then did start intimidating me felt that they had impunity to kind of handle themselves the way they did. And it was like there were intimidators in the neighborhood who were working with law enforcement, who were connected to powerful people, and who were pushing policies and things that were, that the city wanted. And it was, to me, it was like, this is the new COINTELPRO. This is how it works. This is how power works in America right now, in American cities. And I was like really inside of it. And so I could definitely feel the tension. I don't know if they were saying it is.
What measures were you forced to take to safeguard?
Well, the hard thing is that, like, I did leave my place, like, I think even maybe like 8 times over 8 years. Like, I literally like got out of town when I was hearing from various people that, feedback about things. I actually heard, I got some of this into the book, that there was a paid hit on someone I knew and who was very close to me and close to sort of like objecting to what was going on that I was also covering. So I had to get out of town because what I didn't do for a long time, that I finally did, but I did not want to get a weapon. For example, everyone kept, giving me shit about it, basically, and being like, they couldn't believe that I didn't have, like, I started to, of course, understand so many things in new ways, right, about these neighborhoods and why people, they feel they have to carry a weapon. They don't feel safe without carrying a weapon, and but the other thing was, and I later ended up being put into like a Colorado State protection program that's mostly to protect your address and identity from being known. But it's a state-funded program to protect from people who were, there's a video in which the one guy who sued me threatens my life on camera, and in the same video thanks the mayor for hiring him. These are people working for the city of Denver who the state is having to pay to protect me from. So that's where we are. And the Denver media, it's unbelievable. But they, part of them, in a way, because I put some of that sub-story in, I got a lot of good attention in Denver and everything, but there were certain journalists, the reason that some of the sort of news out of it didn't come out the way it should is because they were mad. Basically, the Denver media was like hating on me because, like, who are you? And like acting like I, whatever. I guess they wasn't like friendly or collegial to them but they completely blew the story. I wasn't giving their names or whatever. I was just trying to show the disconnect between what actually happened and what was reported. And they weren't happy, about that, I guess, being called out that way. So I didn't have a lot of allies. The other thing I did actually that was absolutely huge and critical, and I think a lot of investigative journalists would do this, but I laid super low. It kind of sucked. I was pretty like alone and everything, but like for most of those years, I purposefully could not really even be social with many people because I didn't trust anyone. There were absolutely people who were law enforcement undercover who were trying to, buddy up to me a few times. It was just too obvious. And the only way I could actually get this story and get it out, and it kind of shocked them, I think, was because I just laid totally low and didn't really talk to anyone about this. And because as soon as anyone knew anything about it, they were all over it, trying to, either kind of intimidate me or find out stuff about me or offer to help. One guy who turned out to be a police informant was trying to tell me what's my most dangerous mission. He loves that. He's going to help and everything. I was just like, what? So I just had to really kind of like fly under the radar the best I can, and I really, really did do that, and that helped.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for the work. I know we need to wrap up now, so if you have questions, I think we could stick around for a little bit after that. But let's give a round of applause to our panel.
Thank you so much. What an insightful panel. Now we're going into our lunch break. We have lunch from 12 to 1. And then after that, we have a panel with Frontline and Firelight Media. Thank you.